We turn now to Frederick Douglass and the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. It's difficult for me teaching a class like this to say that I have a favorite text that we are working on for the semester, mostly because so many of them are amazing and reward multiple readings. Douglass's text is undoubtedly a difficult text to read. His depictions of slavery are absolutely horrific, and he turns the dials of empathy up to the highest levels that they can go. But in terms of fusing a compelling narrative with gorgeous, breathtaking language and a moral conviction and purpose, few texts that we could look at in this course can stand up to Douglass's narrative. It's a text that I have read multiple times and taught multiple times, and I never cease to find myself astounded at Douglass's ability to generate sentences, to fuse together the autobiographical details of his life as an enslaved man and his growth as a man and eventual escape from slavery with his brilliant, biting, spot-on critique of slavery as an institution and of the southern portion of the United States in tolerating and perpetuating systems of slavery. He is astute at pointing out the hypocrisies of slavery and for indicting all those who participate in the institution. More than anything, Douglass presents the institution of slavery in his narrative as a corrupting force. It is not merely a force that dehumanizes the people who were enslaved. It is certainly that. But Douglass sees as well that the institution of slavery corrupts those who practice it. It corrupts the enslavers. It corrupts the way that they see the world and the way that they interact with other human beings. And because those individuals are participating in the election of officials who are perpetuating the institution of slavery, Douglass's narrative, by extension, sees slavery as a corrupting force in the United States. The way that Douglass weaves all of these threads together, as I said, is often painful to read, but is incredibly insightful, and the language that he uses ranks, for my money, at the top of all of the antebellum writers that we are studying in this class. I'd mentioned before that many times writers before the Civil War era of American literature are sometimes boiled down to Emerson and Thoreau, Melville and Hawthorne and Whitman. Edgar Allan Poe is sometimes thrown in, although Poe certainly has his critics among some literary scholars. Sometimes Emily Dickinson is thrown in as well, and I think Douglass absolutely needs to be thrown in to that list as well. He may not be engaging in fiction writing or poetry, high poetry, in the same way that people like Whitman and Dickinson did, but he is a master with rhetoric and building the case against slavery. And we'll see that when we turn as well to the excerpt provided in your anthology from Douglass's speech on the 4th of July, when we take a look at anti-slavery rhetoric. So Douglass spent more than 50 years of his life working as an advocate for Black Americans. both those who were enslaved before the war, those whom Douglass championed to fight in the war, and then after the war, following the abolition of slavery. At the time of his death, Douglass was considered the most influential black leader of the 19th century and one of America's greatest orators. He made a living not only through writing, but also through speaking. And we'll talk more about his oratory skills when we turn to his 4th of July address. At his core, Douglass believed that he was challenging America to live up to its ideals. Many abolitionists in the decades leading up to the Civil War saw the United States Constitution as a terribly compromised document. That any document that condoned slavery was a document that from the start was absolutely corrupted. And Douglass didn't exactly see it that way. He may have begun his abolitionist career that way, but he came to see the Constitution as a document that needed to have the American culture change to live up to the ideals that were promised in the Constitution. And that's what Douglass devoted his life to. We know that what led Douglass to be able to write this narrative is that after he escaped from slavery, he went north. He became involved in the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, and one meeting he gives a speech where he recounts the incidents from his life. In the audience of the speech is the writer, the abolitionist writer, William Lloyd Garrison, who is the editor of the nation's #1 abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator. And Garrison brings on Douglass as a writer and as a speaker and helps see that Douglass's narrative is published, which it is in 1845. It was a bona fide bestseller in its own time and turned Douglass into an international spokesperson for freedom and liberty. Garrison provides the preface to the narrative. This was a common trope among slave narratives. They would often be prefaced by a white writer testifying to the veracity or to the merit or providing a lens through which the narrative itself should be read or should be considered. So Garrison provides the preface, one of the prefaces actually, to Douglass's narrative. And Garrison's point in his preface is to help rouse the feelings of the readers to embrace the argument that Douglass is making as a powerful anti-slavery argument. Garrison writes on page 1069 of the Norton Anthology of American Literature, Volume B, I shall never forget his, meaning Douglass's, first speech at the convention, the extraordinary emotion it excited in my own mind, the powerful impression it created upon a crowded auditory, completely taken by surprise. The applause which followed from the beginning to the end of his felicitous remarks. I think I had never hated slavery so intensely as at that moment. Certainly my perception of the enormous outrage which is inflicted by it on the godlike nature of its victims was rendered far more clear than ever. Garrison states in his introduction that he understands that there are people in the world who they know that slavery is wrong, or they know that slavery is cruel, but that they don't fully understand the depths of it. And because they don't deny that slavery is holding a human being as property, he says that terrible fact doesn't necessarily convey the sense of injustice, the exposure to outrage, the savage barbarity of the institution of slavery. And he says often that people who walk around unwilling to accept the full cruelties of slavery, it could be attributed to a want of reflection. That's the term Garrison uses on page 1073. But generally, he says it indicates a hatred and a desire to shield slavery from the assaults of its foes. There's another preface provided by the abolitionist Wendell Phillips. And what I want to highlight for you, I guess, to think about the way that Phillips is preparing you to read the text, in the same way that Garrison wants you to understand how the text reveals fully the complete extent of the cruelties of slavery and the dehumanizing characteristics that enslaved people felt. Phillips wants you to think about the text as an act of pure courage. And Phillips writes on page 1075 in your anthology, I hardly knew at the time whether to thank you or not for the sight of them. He's talking here about writing a letter to Douglass. Writing a letter in which he talks about the experience of reading the letter or reading the narrative text. And Phillips says, I hardly knew at the time whether to thank you or not for the sight of them, the memoirs, the text of Douglass's address, when I reflected that it was still dangerous in Massachusetts for honest men to tell their names. Remember, this is a time in which there are many bounty hunters engaged in efforts to try to recapture escaped people who had fled slavery. And at this time in Douglass's life, he had not yet been able to purchase his full freedom to prevent himself from going back into slavery. He said, they say the fathers in 1776 signed the Declaration of Independence with the halter about their necks. You too publish your Declaration of Freedom with dangerous compassing you all around. In all the broad lands which the Constitution of the United States overshadows, there is no single spot, however narrow or desolate, where a fugitive slave can plant himself and say, I am safe. The whole armory of the Northern law has no shield for you. I am free to say that in your place, I should throw the MS into the fire. MS here meaning manuscript. So Phillips is reflecting on the sheer courage that is involved from Douglass to be able to produce this narrative, have it published and distributed among readers in the United States and abroad. So I want you to think about both of those framing devices that come from Garrison and Phillips. That Garrison is praising on the one hand the intensity, the descriptiveness, the power of the rhetoric inside the text, and Phillips is recognizing the pure courage that it takes to actually publish that text at a time when it could have gotten Douglass into, and did get him into, considerable trouble. So now let's turn to the text. In preparation for this, I asked you to read the entirety of Douglass's narrative. And so we'll be going through the narrative chapter by chapter, almost chapter by chapter. We'll skip a couple for the sake of efficiency, but almost chapter by chapter, looking at key passages from Douglass's narrative and trying to think what Douglass is doing with the way that he's writing. Partly I want to draw certain passages to your attention because I think they convey the true spirit of what Douglass is trying to do with his text. But also I want to draw passages to your attention so I can make comments on them from a literary standpoint. Think of the efforts that we're engaged in here as an opportunity to do some close reading on passages inside Douglass's narrative, and to think about how the close reading of the passage speaks more broadly to the entirety of what the text is trying to do. Douglass introduces us to a major theme of his text right off the bat. Chapter 1 opens in the following way. I was born in Tuckahoe, near Hillsborough, and about 12 miles from Easton in Talbot County. I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen any authentic record containing it. By far, the larger part of the slaves know as little of their ages as horses know of theirs. And it is the wish of most masters within my knowledge to keep their slaves thus ignorant. I do not remember to have ever met a slave who could tell of his birthday. They seldom come nearer to it than planting time, harvest time, cherry time, springtime, or fall time. A want of information concerning my own was a source of unhappiness to me, even during childhood. The white children could tell their ages. I could not tell why I ought to be deprived of the same privilege. I was not allowed to make any inquiries of my master concerning it. He deemed all such inquiries on the part of a slave improper and impertinent, and evidence of a restless spirit. So hopefully, having read the entirety of Douglass's narrative, you can appreciate in these opening sentences how Douglass is already establishing for you what the themes are going to be in the text that follows. The importance of knowledge, the importance of being able to affirm something about yourself is tied to the ability to affirm something about your identity and about your personhood. The comparison, the simile that Douglass draws in the third sentence, that slaves know as little of their ages as horses know of theirs, is a brush or an indication toward the theme that Douglass is going to address throughout the text of the way that slavery is a dehumanizing institution. It is an institution that robs people of their humanity, robs them of the will to seek a better life, to try to have the things that a human being needs to have a fulfilled life. And the want of this information, or the lack of this information, the fact that Douglass doesn't know, is a source of deep unhappiness. And that he recognizes that should he try to find out, should he inquire in the effort to learn, he's going to be discouraged from it. Because those who are in charge of keeping people in bondage understand that answering some questions leads to other questions, and that unanswered questions and partially answered questions and then partially unanswered questions lead to a sense, Douglass says, of evidence of a restless spirit. And that is seen as a negative in the eyes of those who are enslaving. Immediately on between pages 1076 and 1077, we have the full extent of the dehumanizing and cruelties of slavery. We're told here that he and his mother were separated at a very early age, that he rarely got a chance to see his mother as a result of that. And that when he did get to see her, he almost never saw her in the daylight because she, held in bondage, had to perform work in the daytime and then came to see him in the evening and was gone before he left, or before he woke in the next morning. But the point here that I want to highlight is Douglass's enumeration of the dehumanizing effects of slavery. Look to page 1077, about halfway down the page. This is Douglass reflecting on the fact that he does not know who his father is, but that many people around him told him that his father was the man who was enslaving his mother. I know of such cases, he writes, and it is worthy of remark that such slaves invariably suffer greater hardships and have more to contend with than others. They are, in the first place, a constant offense to their mistress. She is ever disposed to find fault with them. They can seldom do anything to please her. She is never better pleased than when she sees them under the lash, especially when she suspects her husband of showing to his mulatto children favors which he withholds from his black slaves. The master is frequently compelled to sell this class of slaves out of deference to the feelings of his white wife. And cruel as the deed may strike anyone to be, for a man to sell his own children to human fleshmongers, it is often the dictate of humanity for him to do so. For unless he does this, he must not only whip them himself, but must stand by and see one white son tie up his brother of a few shades darker complexion than himself, and ply the gory lash to his naked back. And if he lisps one word of disapproval, it is set down to his parental partiality, and that only makes a bad matter worse for both himself and the slave whom he would protect and defend. So Douglass is drawing out here how the total depravity of the situation of slavery and what it brings. Not only do you have a situation where somebody who is enslaving somebody else is having sex with them, as we talked about in the last video, raising ethical questions. Can there ever be consent in situations like that? Rape probably is the right word to describe the actions of the enslaver with the enslaved woman, because she cannot give consent, because she is considered property under the law, that she is being raped, that as a result of that rape, she is becoming pregnant with that man's children, that those children suffer hardships, especially hardships because they are the children of the enslaving man. The animosity that is created from the wife who knows that her husband has been cheating on her and raping their slaves. The fact that he often has to sell his own children to other people whom he knows are going to abuse them, and that is considered, quote unquote, the humane thing to do in this situation. Because without that, he is caught in a situation where he has to stand by and watch his own children be beaten, or beat his own children whom he has produced with the women he enslaves. So this information put close to the front of the text provides us with a nice reflection on the type of writing that Douglass is going to do throughout. This is not a straightforward narrative that simply relates the factual or narrative events of Douglass's life. He will often pause the narrative to reflect and engage in some philosophy or reflection, cultural criticism on the institution of slavery itself. And he will do this throughout, and he will do it on a myriad number of themes. Chapter 1 also introduces us to the kind of language that Douglass is going to be capable of producing throughout the entire narrative. Look on page 1078 to reflect on one of Douglass's earliest memories. This is when his aunt is being abused by an overseer named Mr. Plummer. He was a cruel man, hardened by a long life of slaveholding. He would at times seem to take great pleasure in whipping a slave. I have often been awakened at the dawn of day by the most heart-rending shrieks of an own aunt of mine, whom he used to tie up to a joist and whip upon her naked back till she was literally covered with blood. No words, no tears, no prayers from his gory victim seemed to move his iron heart from its bloody purpose. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped. And where the blood ran fastest, there he whipped longest. He would whip her to make her scream and whip her to make her hush, and not until overcome by fatigue would he cease to swing the blood-clotted cow skin. I remember the first time I ever witnessed this horrible exhibition. I was quite a child, but I well remember it. I never shall forget it whilst I remember anything. It was the first of a long series of such outrages of which I was doomed to be a witness and a participant. It struck me with awful force. It was the blood-stained gate, the entrance to the hell of slavery through which I was about to pass. It was a most terrible spectacle. I wish I could commit to paper the feelings with which I beheld it. Now, that final sentence in the passage that I just read is a fascinating rhetorical move on Douglass's part. Because one would think, given what I just read, that Douglass had conveyed how he felt about it. The language is horrible and horrifying in the worst possible way. We really get a sense into how traumatic it was for Douglass. And we can extrapolate from there on how traumatic it must have been for millions of people kept in slavery in the United States. The extent of that trauma boggles the mind. And yet, when we get to the end of this passage, this detailed, imagistic passage, the conclusion, I wish I could commit to paper the feelings with which I beheld it, undermines everything that came before. Because as you're reading, you are wrapped up in the level of horror that Douglass is creating, and you are feeling something from within, and you know that he's writing in a way that is working on you to try to convey how absolutely horrifying it was. But still, no matter how virtuosic the language Douglass can produce, he acknowledges at the end of the line here that he cannot ever fully capture the feelings of how horrible it was. A sense in which the horrors themselves can never fully be comprehended. the horrors themselves can never fully be rendered into language for someone else to understand. But we have a clear indication here that Douglass is capable of rendering some of that emotion for us so that we can come to a closer understanding of what it must have been like in that moment. Another example of Douglass's powerful cultural criticism comes toward the end of chapter 2. This is a passage in which Douglass is reflecting on social perceptions of the institution of slavery. One of the popular social perceptions was that enslaved people sang songs, and that the singing of the songs that were associated with the work being done by enslaved people was seen to be a recognition that slavery itself must not be as bad as people claim that it is. For if they're singing, right, this line of thinking presumably goes, then it can't actually be that bad. But what Douglass wants to do, and he does this throughout the narrative, is he takes a common cultural assumption about the institution of slavery, an assumption that is had based on people who are outside the institution, looking in. And Douglass says, let me take that assumption that you have as an outsider looking in, and let me show you as an insider communicating to you on the outside that you've got it all wrong. And that anything that you think to yourself that is a potential positive or a neutral or a general observation about the institution of slavery is a thought that is perpetuating the institution in a way that is harmful to people. And so this is Douglass on the topic of songs and singing. This is at the bottom of page 1081. I have sometimes thought that the mere hearing of those songs would do more to impress some minds with the horrible character of slavery than the reading of whole volumes of philosophy on the subject could do. Right? There's a kind of romantic idea there, right? Capital R romantic idea, that somehow there's a way through art that can tap into an emotional or psychological experience that any kind of writing on philosophy or enlightenment principles or anything like that, it can never hold a candle to the visceral experience of hearing the sorrow. And that just the hearing of the sorrow and the art of hearing of the songs can actually say more than anything else ever can. I did not, when a slave, understand the deep meaning of those rude and apparently incoherent songs. I was myself within the circle, so that I neither saw nor heard as those without might see and hear. They told a tale of woe, which was then altogether beyond my feeble comprehension. They were tones loud, long, and deep. They breathed the prayer of complaint. They breathed the prayer and complaint of souls boiling over with the bitterest anguish. Every tone was a testimony against slavery and a prayer to God for deliverance from chains. The hearing of those wild notes always depressed my spirit and filled me with ineffable sadness. I frequently found myself in tears while hearing them. The mere recurrence to those songs even now afflicts me. And while I am writing these lines, an expression of feeling has already found its way down my cheek. To those songs I traced my first glimmering conception of the dehumanizing character of slavery. I can never get rid of that conception. Those songs still follow me. To deepen my hatred of slavery, and quicken my sympathies for my brethren in bonds. Skip a few sentences, and he says, I have often been utterly astonished since I came to the North to find persons who speak of the singing among slaves as evidence of their contentment and happiness. It is impossible to conceive of a greater mistake. Slaves sing most when they are most unhappy. The songs of the slave represent the sorrows of his heart, and he is relieved by them only as an aching heart is relieved by its tears. As such, at least such is my experience. I have often sung to drown my sorrow, but seldom to express my happiness. The idea of the inside-out perception of analyzing the institution of slavery is a critical literary and rhetorical skill that Douglass employs throughout the narrative. Let's take a look at another moment of this. It has to do with the question of the way that enslaved people will often talk about the people who hold them in bondage. Douglass is pointing out again that this is a common argument that is held up by those who support the institution of slavery or those who are indifferent to the institution of slavery. And this is the premise that when asked, an enslaved person will often speak kindly of the people who are enslaving them. And though under the law, we know that the testimony of enslaved people was not allowed in courtrooms. Douglass talks about that later in the narrative when he talks about even if he had 10,000 witnesses to a crime, none of their testimony would be permitted to be entered into the record merely because they were black, merely because they were enslaved people. Douglass points out that oftentimes people use the testimony of enslaved people as evidence that they are happy. But, he points out, this is where they get it wrong. He tells the story of an enslaved man who meets the man who enslaves him. This is Colonel Lloyd, who owns 1,000 enslaved people. But the man doesn't recognize that he's speaking to Colonel Lloyd. And he answers questions honestly about how dissatisfied he is. Douglass says the man finds out that he was informed by his overseer that, this is on page 1084, for having found fault with his master, he was now to be sold to a Georgia trader. He was immediately chained and handcuffed, and thus, without a moment's warning, he was snatched away and forever sundered from his family and friends by a hand more unrelenting than death. This is the penalty of telling the truth, of telling the simple truth in answer to a series of plain questions. It is partly in consequence of such facts that slaves, when inquired of as to their condition and the character of their masters, almost universally say they are contented and that their masters are kind. The slaveholders have been known to send in spies among the slaves to ascertain their views and feelings in regard to their condition. The frequency of this has had the effect to establish among the slaves the maxim that a still tongue makes a wise head. They suppress the truth rather than take the consequences of telling it, and in doing so prove themselves a part of the human family. Okay? That line reminds me of the Dickinson poem, "Tell all the truth, but tell it slant." Right? The idea that sometimes telling the truth exactly as it is has such a force that you'll turn people off, you'll turn people away, you'll turn people against you, you'll harm yourself in the process because you tell the honest truth, frankly. And Douglass observes here a pattern of lying to protect oneself, right? Nobody wants to be taken into chains, handcuffed, taken away from your family and friends with no moment's notice, never to see them again. Nobody would dare want to be treated that way. And so it's safer not to say anything. And by not saying anything, then you can at least protect yourself. Or by lying, you can at least protect yourself so that you're not taken away from your family and your friends. And Douglass's conclusion here is that this proves themselves a part of the human family. It's the same idea that he adopts a little bit later on the page when he talks about that enslaved people, like all other people, because they're people, have their own prejudices, and that they engage in rationalizing or illogical behavior just as any other person in order to try to get through their lives. So he talks about arguments that enslaved people would have with each other about whose enslaver is kinder or more supportive. And he writes at the top of page 1085, they seemed to think that the greatness of their masters was transferable to themselves. It was considered as being bad enough to be a slave, but to be a poor man's slave was deemed a disgrace indeed. The ability of Douglass to see human nature so clearly and effectively communicate it is one of the great strengths of the narrative. And in doing so, Douglass is able to simultaneously give you a glimpse into a side of slavery that you might not have imagined. But every step of the way, he does not deviate a centimeter from the idea that he is establishing the core humanity of enslaved people and critiquing the institution of slavery as a dehumanizing force against the people who are enslaved and against the people who are doing the enslaving. We're going to continue our discussion of Douglass's narrative in the next video, and we'll bring the narrative to a close. And this is getting in the next video, we'll get into some of the more famous passages from the narrative and draw attention to Douglass's very self-conscious literary style.